And we talked, real often when she was away at college, and she used to say her friends were always surprised how open she'd be with me. And they told me that after she died too, just that, and she was. And in her openness, she also reverted back. She was 18, when she was back here. And she reverted back to a little girl a lot of times if somebody upset her or was mean to her, or if a friend ignored her, or like she was at a concert one time in Tulsa and it got too crowded and she started having a panic attack and she couldn't breathe. And the first responders told me that what she was crying, and she was 17 then, she was going, "Mommy, mommy, mommy." So, sometimes I don't let myself think about this anymore, but when it first happened, I really worried that while she was being killed, she was, saying that to herself. And, that just tore at my heart that, but from what the police tell me, she was suffocated instantly. So I'm hoping, and it doesn't matter because I can't relive it continually, that she wasn't doing that.
Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Michael Whelan. Before we get started with today's story, I would first like to thank Dr. Maggie Zingman, who you'll be hearing from throughout this episode, as well as Lindsay Schrod, the curator of the Chrysalis chapters, a website dedicated to telling the stories of murder victims. Without both of them, this episode would not have been possible, so I extend a heartfelt thank you to both. If you would like to learn more about this show, such as how to support Unresolved or get in touch with myself, just listen through to the close of this episode or visit the podcast website at unresolved.me. Once again, that's unresolved.me. Now, without any further ado, here is the story of Brittany Phillips. Brittany Ivana Sarah Phillips was born on October 4th, 1985, in St. Petersburg, Florida. As you'll soon hear, she was the second child of her mother, Dr. Maggie Zingman, following her brother, who was just about a year older.
She was my second child. I had a son. I still have a son. When she came out because she had to go C-section, so she looked like a little angel when she came out, perfectly round head, no hair or anything. And she had some problems with, some medical things initially when she was first born, but she, after about a couple months, everything was fine. She ended up being bald for 2 years, but then suddenly developed these long blonde ringlets, which, she would stop traffic from age 1 to, before she died, because she just had these long cascading curls, and she, from day one, she was very energetic. She would get a number of injuries. I think she had a scar on the top of her forehead, her chin on one side of the cheek, the other side by her eye, because she was fearless. She would just go running places, jumping off of things. I mean, this was like at 5 and 6 she was even doing that. And she was only 15 months younger than her brother, so they went through those periods of being really close and, then being sibling rivalry. She got involved with dance and gymnastics really young, which she continued till she was about 14. So she was very active. She seemed to have a natural talent for the dance, which I danced most of my life. So, I don't know if that was genetic or not. She was extremely intelligent, and because we were in Louisville for a year when she was in kindergarten, she was able to get into a kindergarten a year younger. So she was able to actually go through school always a year younger than all her classmates, and yet she was still at the top of the class through grade school, junior high, and high school, which at high school she did get a chemistry scholarship to go away to college.
Brittany's father was not really an active presence in her life outside of her early childhood, which is when her parents divorced. Both Brittany and her brother, Josh, would be raised by their mother, Maggie, who first moved them from Florida to Kentucky for a very brief period of time. Then, in 1991, this small family moved out to Oklahoma, which would prove to be their permanent home. Brittany and her brother, Josh, were close. Although, as Maggie would explain, the two had a very contentious sibling rivalry, which I guess can be expected for any set of siblings so close in age. After all, he was only 15 months older than her, so the two were just a grade or so apart for the entirety of their childhoods. In her childhood, Brittany began to express an interest in acting and modeling. Even though she was unnaturally short for her age, a defect she constantly blamed on her mother's genetics. She quickly became a natural when it came to posing for the camera.
She also was, she blamed me for being short. She said it was my genes' fault because I'm only 5'2" and she was only 5'1". But she was really beautiful. So when she was around 8 or so, we did something called Wearable Art in Tulsa with the Tulsa Artist Coalition. And from that, she started doing some modeling with the agency here, in clothes, TV commercials, more public service type of commercials and stuff. And so off and on, she did a little bit of that growing up. And, some of my best pictures that I have of her, I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but there's one with a hat where she has her arms sort of crossed in front of her. And that was when we were in Dallas and talking with the agency, but they wanted her to go to New York, and I didn't want that life for her, so we didn't do that. But so, she was really, really beautiful, but she was also extremely smart, like I said, and for some strange reason, and it wasn't my genes, because I'm a writer and I'm a psychologist, but she wanted to go into chemistry, and she did well in that.
Brittany's intelligence began to earn her accolades at school, especially as she progressed through Union High School in Tulsa. This would eventually earn her a full-ride scholarship to her mother's alma mater, Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. But according to Maggie, Brittany never considered herself that bright. She always seemed to credit the grades on her good study habits, and instead tried to convince others that they were much smarter than she was. Despite being incredibly smart, beautiful, and accomplished, Brittany wasn't one of the quote-unquote cool kids in high school. In fact, it seemed to many of her classmates that Brittany did not really seem to have many close friends. Rather, she was just very friendly to everyone. A Reddit user named AlleyCat1282, who was a former high school classmate of Brittany, wrote about her, quote, "While Brittany Phillips wasn't a close friend of mine, I did know her throughout high school, and she was a really nice girl. We all knew someone like her in high school, the type that you did not know very well, but who always knew who you were and would acknowledge you in the halls." This reputation wasn't really known by Brittany's mom until years later, at which point it was too late to ask Brittany about it.
She wasn't of a particular group in school, and I really found out that more after she died, because I have a number of people who would contact me and say, well, I wasn't in the popular group, but Brittany would always, be sitting with me at lunch or talking to me. So she really seemed to have a compassion for everyone.
Brittany graduated from Union High School in May of 2003 at the age of 17. She was younger than many of her peers, but already well on her way to figuring out what she wanted to do with her life. Following the death of a grandmother due to cancer, Brittany had decided to dedicate her life to chemistry. In particular, she wanted to study cancer and, hopefully, help figure out a possible cure. Later that summer, in August of 2003, Brittany set off for St. Petersburg, Florida, to attend her mother's alma mater, Eckerd College. She had received a full-ride chemistry scholarship, but would only last a single year at the Florida-based institute. While away, she began to grow incredibly homesick, eventually deciding to attend class closer to home the following spring.
She got a scholarship to the college I went to, Eckerd College in Florida, and she was down there for the whole year, and what she was planning to do is she wanted to go into cancer research. She had lost her dad's mom to cancer, and so that was sort of incentive for her, and when she went away to college in Florida, I remember just bawling as I watched her in my rearview mirror, and, that's when I was worried about her, not when she came back to Tulsa.
In May of 2004, Approaching the end of her freshman year of college, Brittany decided to pack up her belongings and move back to Tulsa, Oklahoma. As you heard, her mother was living about an hour away from Tulsa, in Chandler, where she worked as a counselor for a female correctional facility. But Brittany still had several friends and family members in the Tulsa area, including her brother Josh, with whom she would become incredibly close with over the next couple of months.
We had all been living in Tulsa, and after she left, I got a job at a female prison in Tulsa, and so I moved about 50 miles from Tulsa. So when she moved back, I had been up just about 3 months at the house I had just bought, and so she moved into apartments right next to the high school where she graduated from. So I had no worries. We checked it and everything was fine, and she was going to go to the junior college, which she did start there, get a few more extra credits, and then come up and live with me and go to Oklahoma State University, where I got my master's and PhD. So, there was nothing foreboding at all that something bad was going to happen.
At the age of 18, Brittany Phillips already had 1 year of college under her belt. Now, as the summer of 2003 came to a close, she was living in a quiet apartment complex named Glen Eagles Apartments, now known as Somerset Park at Union Apartments. This was in a quiet area of town not known for any violent crime, which was quite literally just a stone's throw away from her high school, Union High. Here, she lived in a second-story apartment all by herself, which was a big step for an 18-year-old. Brittany began taking classes at Tulsa Community College, where she had several friends. She was still planning to enter the medical field and focus on cancer research, but had decided to earn her associate's degree before making any more major life decisions. That September, Brittany began settling into her routine of attending class, oftentimes driving with her friends to and from school. However, on Monday, September 27th, 2004, Brittany contacted her mom and told her that she was starting to suffer from seasonal allergies. She had tried scheduling a doctor's appointment, but had some issues doing so. That evening, at around 9 p.m., Brittany called her mom and asked for some help. Over the phone, Maggie told her daughter that she would schedule her an appointment for that Friday, and she would figure everything out. Brittany told her that she was getting ready to drop off a friend of hers, a classmate that lived about 2 miles away from her apartment, along East 51st Street and South Memorial Drive. Then she was planning to head back home and go to bed. That night, over the phone, the final words spoken by both mother and daughter were, "I love you." Over the next few days, Brittany Phillips was a no-show for any of her classes, an absence that was quickly noticed by her friends, who began to grow concerned. During that same span of time, Maggie, Brittany's mother, who lived about an hour away, was unable to get in touch with her. She would leave numerous voicemails on Brittany's answering machine, but did not hear back.
I talked to her that Monday. She was going to a doctor's appointment because she has these allergies and she's getting frustrated. And I said I'd see her that weekend and, I'd get her a doctor's appointment. So I talked to her that Monday, couldn't get hold of her Tuesday and Wednesday, and then Thursday night at about 9 p.m. I called and said, please call me back. I know you're fine, but this is your mom and you know how I worry. And then it was 1 a.m. the next morning when I got the knock on my door.
In the early morning hours of Friday, October 1st, 2004, Dr. Maggie Zingman responded to a knock at her front door. As she recalls, it was almost like a scene out of a movie, with rain pouring outside of her home in Chandler, Oklahoma. When she opened up the door, she saw a young sheriff's deputy standing there, who promptly asked her for her name. And then, he gave her the news that no parent should ever have to hear. According to Maggie, he told her, quote, "You need to call Tulsa police. Your daughter's been murdered." In those early morning hours, Dr. Maggie Zingman would learn that her daughter, 18-year-old Brittany Phillips, had been found in her apartment, having been raped and murdered. Her body had apparently been laying in her apartment for several days, having only been discovered after a wellness check was called in by some worried friends of Brittany's. Maggie immediately set off for Brittany's apartment in Tulsa, which was about an hour away. By the time she got there, Brittany's body had already been taken away from the scene by the medical examiner, and she would, unfortunately, never get the chance to see her daughter again.
Obviously, being a parent of young children, I wasn't planning for any type of funeral or anything, so we had no funeral plans. The night that I was notified, it took me about an hour or two to decide whether I should wake up my parents or not, which is really bizarre because, you know, that just doesn't make sense. But finally, when I called them, all my family came down, got flights within the day down there. So I was raised in a reformed Jewish temple, which basically means it's philosophy more than practice. So I wasn't really part of a temple here, but there was a temple that we had interacted with some. So I went there, talked to the rabbi, and he had us pick the funeral plots, two of them for me and for Brittany. And so, we set up a payment plan and everything. And then she was with the ME, the medical examiner, for about 3 days. So we're talking October 1st, October 2nd, and October 3rd she was finally released. And so I went to talk to the funeral directors, and he would not let me see her. He only let me go to her with a blanket over his face. And what he told me, and I didn't have a voice then, was that because she had been autopsied and everything, that she wouldn't look like anything I remember. And so, it totally upset me. I mean, I ran out of there crying, and the way I said goodbye to her was the same way I used to calm her down, which she had this little pug nose, which she hated. She said it gave her all her problems. But I just ran my finger down her forehead and her nose and, told her I'm sorry. But I didn't get to see her when the police took her. When I got down to her apartment that night, they had already identified her by her license, and I didn't know that I could ask to see her before the autopsy. I always assumed that it was the family member that identified them. So twice in the final times, I was never allowed to see her. So that was awful. The funeral was full of her friends and my coworkers and stuff, and it was just, I just remember sitting with Josh, beside me, and my parents beside me, and just, that awful, just gut-wrenching, stomach-burning, chest-tearing cry. I just couldn't stop it. And I do remember, walking out and seeing the media around, because, of course, it's, somebody murdered in Tulsa. And, just holding on to my mom. And I've seen pictures of that, and I can remember the intensity of that. But the one sort of light moment of it was, and somebody told me something else, and I don't remember what it was, but there was some other light moment. But I remember looking back behind, we were in the lead car, and it was just a long, long line of cars. And I thought, Brittany would really love this,
Brittany's funeral was held just a few days after the discovery of her body, on October 4th, 2004, which coincidentally would have also been her 19th birthday. A funeral procession would lead to the Rose Hill Memorial Park in Tulsa, where Brittany's body would be interred. Through the entire proceeding, Brittany was remembered by her friends, family members, and other loved ones, who all recalled her as the smart, funny, beautiful, intelligent, and kind soul they had come to know. However, through the entire proceeding, all that Brittany's mother could think about was what her daughter's final moments had been like. Over the next several years, she would wrestle with the unsettling fact that her daughter had been killed likely just hours after she had last spoken to her.
And we talked, real often when she was away at college, and she used to say her friends were always surprised how open she'd be with me. And they told me that after she died too, just that, and she was. And in her openness, she also reverted back. She was 18, when she moved back here. And she reverted back to a little girl a lot of times if somebody upset her or was mean to her, or if a friend ignored her, or like she was at a concert one time in Tulsa and it got too crowded and she started having a panic attack and she couldn't breathe, and the first responders told me that what she was crying, and she was 17 then, she was going, "Mommy, mommy, mommy." So, sometimes I don't let myself think about this anymore, but when it first happened, I really worried that if while she was being killed, she was, saying that to herself, and, that just tore at my heart that, but from what the police tell me, she was suffocated instantly. So I'm hoping, and it doesn't matter because I can't relive it continually, that she wasn't doing that.
The body of Brittany Phillips had been discovered just hours prior to her loved ones learning about her death, on the evening of Thursday, September 30th, 2004. A worried friend had tried to check in on Brittany earlier that evening after not seeing her in class or hearing from her for several days. This friend had then called police and asked them to perform a wellness check on her. At around 9 p.m. that Thursday, police had entered Brittany's second-story apartment along 65th Street. Inside of her apartment bedroom, police found her body lying on the floor next to her bed, in the opposite direction of where her pillows and blankets were aligned. There appeared to have been an altercation before her death, with her apartment appearing to have been ransacked, although there has been no information on what, if anything, had been stolen. Investigators believe that Brittany had fought back against her attacker, due to some details that have yet to be released to the public. However, in conversations with her mother, I learned that police found proof of Brittany having been pushed up against a wall across the room from where her body was eventually found, implying that a physical struggle had undoubtedly taken place. It appeared that, prior to her death, Brittany had been raped. The cause of death was later determined to be strangulation, but it was unknown if her killer had used an object to do so, or if he had simply used his strength and body weight to strangle her. Brittany's remains were identified by police at the crime scene, who compared her remains to pictures from a driver's license recovered at the scene. Within a few hours of her discovery, Brittany's remains had been sent off to the medical examiner for an autopsy, and that, in addition to the several days of decomposition that had taken place, meant that Brittany's loved ones were never able to see her body, not even during the funeral or memorial service. It would later be learned that DNA was discovered at the crime scene, which is believed to have come from the culprit. This DNA was found in 2 separate samples, which came from the same individual, who did not appear to be anyone previously associated with Brittany. Due to technological limits at the time, there was only so much that police could do after submitting the DNA to local and national databases, where it ultimately failed to match up with any known records. Not much would be written about this DNA for the first decade or so of this case, but in recent years, that DNA sample has come up quite a bit, so I will go into some more detail about that later in this episode. Out of all of the details that investigators would grapple with in this case, the most perplexing one was how Brittany's killer had gotten into her apartment. After all, she did live on the 2nd floor, meaning that the access points were rather limited. But as police learned more about the crime scene, they continued to create more questions for themselves. The doors into Brittany's apartment showed no sign of forced entry, neither the front door nor the back door, which led to a private 2nd-story balcony. This implied that neither door had served as an entrance for the killer, but police could not rule them out. It was possible, however unlikely, that either door had been left unlocked, and the killer might have contorted or climbed onto the back porch. Then, there were the windows to the apartment. Like the doors, there was no sign of forced entry, no clues that any of the windows had been forced open from the outside. However, investigators would discover that at least one window had had its screen removed, which provided investigators with a possible answer. Like climbing up to the back porch, this would have been quite the physical feat for the culprit, but it wasn't impossible. However, police would later state that the removal of the window's screen might have been a tactic meant to quote-unquote stage a crime scene, so it does not seem like a theory that they are comfortable with. Perhaps the most realistic and terrifying option was the possibility that Brittany's killer had accessed her apartment through the attic, which she shared with 7 other apartments. All 8 apartments in her building shared an attic space, which had access points in each closet. Feasibly, this meant that anybody from these apartments had access to the neighboring units through this shared attic space. It is not known if this is how the culprit had gained access to Brittany's apartment, but police believe that there is a strong possibility that it was. A detective that stood 6'3" was easily able to fit through the opening in Brittany's closet, meaning that a man of good stature would have been able to do so quite easily for any of the apartments in Brittany's building. As someone who's lived in an apartment complex with a shared attic, I can't even imagine how terrifying that might be. And on a side note, I encourage all of you that live in a similar unit to contact your landlords to get a lock, or simply do so yourself. Over the years, police have speculated that Brittany Phillips' killer had gained entry to her apartment before she got home on the evening of Monday, September 27th. It's possible that, after speaking to her mother and then dropping off her friend, she returned to her apartment and was immediately attacked. The exact time of the assault is unknown, with police later speculating that the attack happened sometime between 9 p.m. that night and 8 a.m. the following morning, September 28th. Other than that, there is not much that is known about Brittany's death, at least not until the discovery of her body roughly 3 days after she was killed. Tulsa police would later release a profile for this killer, which I have paraphrased into the following points. A. He may be someone who is up and/or alone at night. B. He may have sexual problems, which he struggles to deal with on a regular basis. C. He may be into high-risk behaviors that are dangerous to himself or others, or may cause pain, such as painful sex acts. D. He may be someone with anger issues, who constantly deals with issues of self-worth. E. He may or may not have been previously arrested for rape. However, if he was likely charged with crimes such as endangering or public indecency. Crimes that won't put him on investigators' radar and/or won't force him to register as a sex offender. F. He may live outside of the Tulsa area. He also may or may not have traveled in September or October of 2004, and upon his return, started acting differently, i.e. being more anxious, angry, depressed, engaging in heavy drug or alcohol abuse, etc. G. He may have been outgoing, but possibly became more withdrawn following the murder. H. He may have attempted to hurt or kill himself in the past. He may have succeeded in the years since. I. He may drive along I-35, I-44, or I-40 because of work, or he traveled through the Tulsa region semi-regularly for other reasons. J. He may have had a public service job that gave him access to customer addresses, jobs such as a utility worker, cell phone provider, etc. This information gave police a foundation on which to base their search for the culprit, but it would prove unsuccessful in the weeks, months, and years after Brittany's murder. In the aftermath of this tragic incident, Dr. Maggie Zingman, Brittany's mother, struggled with a direction in which to take her life. Following her daughter's death, Maggie was left adrift without any kind of resolution, and got tired of simply following an investigation that had quickly reached a dead end.
For the first 2 years, I just stood on the street corners handing out flyers near her apartment and stuff, and then we had the DNA, and they started telling me they were, matching it against 500, 600, 800 people with no hits, and I thought, and some of the detectives were saying, he's good chance he's still here, good chance he could have been coming down the crossroads, I-35, I-44, and I thought, how do I get this story nationwide? And so I started trying to query national media, and they weren't interested, and then I started seeing these wrapped, mostly trucks around, that had the vinyl wrapped on them, and I was at a restaurant one night, and I saw a truck, and it was fully wrapped, and so I left a note on it, and that started the relationship with Travis, who owns Midwest Wraps in Tulsa. And he said, let me talk to Feller's Vinyl, which is the big international vinyl company. And they have a school that teaches wrapping and billboards down here in they together decided to donate the vinyl and the artwork and help me create something that would go, that people could recognize if I drove it somewhere. And so I don't know if Brittany got into my head, but something got into my head, and I thought, what is something that people can just drive by and it'll immediately click, and then they can go search it, and that was where I came up with Caravan to Catch a Killer.
At this point, Maggie decided to cover her vehicle in photos of Brittany, as well as images and information pertinent to the crime. This would later take the form of a suspect sketch created by the DNA profile, as well as phone numbers for a tip line and an associated website link. Her car was painted bright purple and pink, giving it a design that has evolved over multiple incarnations. Maggie is now on her third such vehicle, having racked up hundreds of thousands of miles by traveling the nation and speaking to news agencies, journalists, organizations, basically anyone that will listen.
I initially started to just share her murder because, there was no way to get stories across the U.S. and nobody told me how to do this. I just decided, okay, day before I go to a city, I'm going to write emails to all the media. Then the next day, hopefully do stories, go to the city center, talk with detectives, talk with sheriffs if the, legislature's in session. And so I started that in 2007. I think I got 5 stories for about 3 weeks of traveling, and just kept doing that. And, started in years, 2010 to 2015. I mean, I was trying to be out 3 to 4, sometimes 5 weeks, and I was getting 15 to 16 stories each time I was out. I mean, it really seemed, locally, it picks up. I mean, everybody sees the story as her being the girl next door, and I always would find murders and things like that in that town that would relate to it, not just making it Brittany. But about my second or third year out, a group called Surviving Parents Coalition contacted me, and that's where I really began to learn about DNA and stuff. And so by 2011 or 12, half of it was getting tips for Brittany, but half of it was for educating people about DNA at arrest and the difference of taking DNA at arrest and the difference of taking it at conviction, and how it means predators being off the streets in the first couple of years versus 20 years later with as many crimes. And so the focus, especially now as the murder's hitting 15 years, is a lot more on the laws. It's also very big on asking homicide families, in those towns to get in touch with me. And Lindsay and another lady have helped create Voices of Forgotten Homicides, which is a group for people sharing their stories. And another way, that because not everybody's as crazy as me driving 230,000 miles, but so we're trying to create a network where we can share all the stories as we gather them and stuff. So, it's about, trying to solve her murder. It's about trying to educate, and it's about connecting. And it's about a mom who's really very egotistical and loves the fact that 1 million plus people have gotten to know my daughter, who might have known her otherwise.
Maggie admits that this venture of hers has been daunting and draining, not only on the soul, as she has to recount her darkest days regularly, but on the wallet, as she has really drained her savings in this endeavor. However, despite this, she hopes to keep at it, if not to help solve Brittany's case, then to keep her story alive for as long as possible. In addition to spreading the word about Brittany's unsolved murder, Dr. Zingman has also been pushing for wholesale DNA reform, not only in Oklahoma, but throughout the nation. She has been encouraging lawmakers and police agencies to initiate DNA collection at the time of arrest, a law currently on the books in more than half the nation, but not everywhere. With her drive, Maggie was able to successfully help pass a law in Oklahoma in 2016, but the state has been dragging its heels on allocating any funding for DNA collection in the years since. That just means that Maggie is going to keep at it, preaching her daughter's story and the potentials of DNA collection. In 2007, after more than 3 years of inactivity in this case, police decided to release some information about the crime scene in the hopes of inspiring some new leads. They announced that a light purple pillowcase had been found at the crime scene, which did not match any of Brittany's linens. Investigators believed it had likely been left behind by the culprit, who had brought it to the scene for some unknown reason. Perhaps having brought it to abscond with some of Brittany's belongings but forgetting about it at the scene. Detective Jeff Felton stated at the time, quote, "We believe that the perpetrator may have brought the pillowcase with him and left it behind." Police had initially refrained from releasing this information, believing that it might encourage Brittany's killer to discard other similar linens. But now, roughly 3 years later, they no longer believed that this was a risk, and wanted to know if anyone knew of someone who had similar linens, but might have been missing a pillowcase or two. Several years would continue to pass, and in 2013, as the 10-year mark of the crime quickly approached, police announced that they were continuing to investigate the case. Despite it being handled by the cold case unit, police were still continuing to receive tips from the public, and were still actively investigating the case. By this point, Maggie had begun her Caravan to Catch a Killer, and that had drawn some interest to the case from all across the country, attracting the attention of regional news stations. The next year, 2014, the 10-year anniversary of Brittany's death officially came and went, and it was reported that police had begun to investigate a new person of interest, who they believe may have played some part in the crime. This POI fit the profile originally released by investigators, but had no known connection to Brittany, not through friends or family or class, etc. Police seemed pretty optimistic about this lead, and stated that they were looking for this individual to collect a DNA sample. However, this lead seems to have gone nowhere, as police have not spoken about this person of interest again in the years since. It wasn't until just recently that the DNA recovered from the crime scene became relevant to the story once again. For years, police had been testing the DNA against local and national databases, running the sample against millions of names in CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, as well as thousands of POIs from the region, all of whom had failed to come back with a positive hit. Well, in 2018, it was announced that the DNA sample found at the crime scene had been submitted to Caravan Nanolabs, the DNA analysis service that has recently made international headlines for helping bring some cold cases to resolution. You may recognize this name from recently solved cases such as the Bear Brook murders, or from the original Night Stalker, aka the East Area Rapist and Golden State Killer. Caravan is the lab that tested those decades-old samples and helped lead investigators to answers. While Caravan continues to test these samples in the hopes of identifying the culprit in this decade-plus cold case, their services were able to create a quote-unquote snapshot. Using the DNA samples found at the crime scene, these analysts were able to create a likely portrait of the killer, which would use the DNA to figure out his heritage, his genetics, and even his likely physical appearance. According to this snapshot created by Caravan Nanolabs, the killer of Brittany Phillips is likely a white male of Northern European descent, with hair that is either dark blonde or brown, and eyes that are either blue or green. The age of this killer is still unknown, but the snapshot created a realistic-looking sketch of what the killer would have looked like at the age of 25, which is typical for such composites. This individual did not appear to be anyone that Brittany's loved ones knew, not really looking like any of her friends or classmates. But according to Brittany's mother, Maggie, this was the kind of young man that Brittany would have found attractive. Her type, if you will. This has led to some in the year or so since the release of this snapshot to speculate that this young man might have been someone known by Brittany, whom she had simply not told anyone about. A boyfriend or someone she was trying to keep private, something like that. However, police insist that virtually every young man tentatively connected to Brittany has submitted a DNA sample, and has had said sample compared against the suspect's DNA profile. This includes all of Brittany's ex-boyfriends, friends, acquaintances, neighbors, classmates, etc. Investigators have run more than 3,000 individual tests, and none have ever come back as a match, implying that this individual, whoever he was someone that Brittany either did not know or did not tell anyone about. Despite the lack of any definitive answers, this snapshot allowed investigators much more wiggle room to conduct their investigation. It gave them a solid profile of a killer to pursue, and allowed Brittany's case to gain media coverage once again. It also provided Brittany's mother, Maggie, with a new set of allies to assist her in her quest for justice.
So that has been a godsend. We finally, they got a grant, I guess, or the money to send it off to Caravan about a year and a half ago. And it took about 3 months, and we got the picture back. And from the first 2 or 3 days of media coverage, just local, of course not national, we got over 72 to 100 tips just from the picture. And the surprising thing was, even though it's not age progressed, a lot of people said, well, that's what my boyfriend looked like back then, or that's what my ex-husband looked like. So people were age progressing it themselves. On the other side of that, I got an email from a lady who now has a very dear place in my heart named C.C. Moore, which I'm sure you're aware of her. She's GED match, and, well, she used GED match, but she's been solving a lot of these cold cases and stuff. And she said, are you aware that there was an offer with Caravan to your police department to do GED match and otherwise analysis of the DNA? And I said, no, I wasn't. So I talked to my detective, who's my second detective, because the first one retired, and he said he'd look into it. And so, long story short, in the long run, she got the right to do it. So she analyzed it. And from the analysis, it wasn't a real good one, but they are looking at some like 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th cousin, So with all the issues with GED match and the opt-in, opt-out now, Cece's still working on it. She is just a very unbelievable person with as much national work as she does, that she takes the time to keep communicating with me and keep working on our case.
Before I begin to wrap up this episode, there is one major sticking point that I would like to address. For more than a decade now, Dr. Maggie Zingman has traveled around the nation, speaking to numerous reporters, organizations, lawmakers, and police agencies about the importance of DNA collection. Most of the time, she has been addressing regional laws regarding DNA acquisition at the time of arrest, but has always given her opinion on A, how this should be implemented by Oklahoma State, and B, how this might help her catch her daughter's killer. Well, unfortunately, Oklahoma has been reticent to accept Dr. Zingman's demands. Despite passing a law requiring DNA be taken at the point of arrest, the state has not really allocated any funding for these programs, meaning that many of the changes proposed by Maggie have not even been partially implemented, let alone fully adopted by police agencies. In addition, a more serious issue facing Oklahomans has presented itself over the past couple of years, and that is the prevailing issue that is Oklahoma's failure to test rape kits. Throughout Oklahoma, literally thousands of rape kits have gone untested for decades. These were kits taken from sexual assault survivors and victims, following harrowing ordeals that no human should ever have to go through, where DNA was collected but ultimately never tested. These rape kits sat around for years, decades even, and had been doing nothing but collecting dust. That is, of course, if they were even kept, because as it turns out, Oklahoma has no law requiring law enforcement agencies test or even keep these rape kits for posterity's sake. and an untold number of these kits had been discarded or destroyed in the years since. The Tulsa Police Department, the same agency handling the unsolved murder of Brittany Phillips, had around 3,000 of these untested rape kits dating back to the early 1990s. These kits were only discovered in the fall of 2017, following an extensive state audit, which was aimed at trying to figure out how deep-seated this issue was. Turns out the answer was very, as this was just one police agency out of hundreds. A $1.5 million federal grant allocated funding to test these kits the following year, in 2018. But due to Oklahoma's statute of limitations on rape and forced sodomy, which only lasts 12 years, believe it or not, these rape kits are being prioritized based on age and the likelihood of prosecution. Meaning, of course, that many cases older than 12 years at the point of testing, aka sexual assault cases close in time and proximity to Brittany Phillips' rape and murder, were not high in terms of priority. And for the record, this is not an issue that is isolated to Oklahoma. Many states struggle with funding forensic testing labs, and tend to have trouble when it comes to investigating sexual crimes. Oklahoma is just one state of several in which this killer and rapist might have been active in, but has been allowed to slip under the radar in the years since. It is possible, if not likely, that the person who attacked Brittany Phillips in September of 2004 has been involved in other similar incidents, either before or after, and possibly even nearby the crime scene. But due to apathy and or simple lack of funding, this culprit has been allowed to live out their life unabated in the years since. For all we know, Brittany's murder was just an escalation in terms of violence. Based on the severity of the crime, it is possible that her killer had hurt women before, and might have moved on to other victims in the years since. More than a year after Caravan Nanolabs created the snapshot of Brittany Phillips' killer, police remain hopeful that they'll be able to find this culprit the same way that other killers have been identified, through DNA testing sites, such as GED Match, Family Tree DNA, and a handful of others that have proven invaluable to law enforcement. Due to the massive influx of law enforcement agencies hoping to use these services to close case files, as well as the natural limitations of this technology, answers in Brittany's case have not become evident yet, but investigators and loved ones remain hopeful that the identity of Brittany's killer is close at hand. The murder is still being investigated by Tulsa police, primarily by homicide detective Eddie Majors, who works on cold cases for the department. He is the second detective to oversee the investigation, following the retirement of his predecessor a few years ago, Detective Jeff Felton. Detective Majors has been handling the case for about 5 years now, and is trusted by Brittany's mother, Dr. Maggie Zingman, who continues to be the main driving force behind this story. In addition to her continuous tours with the Caravan to catch a killer, Dr. Zingman runs a website dedicated to Brittany's still unsolved murder, www.brittanyphillipsmurder.net. She continues to do whatever she can to bring attention to the case, traveling around the nation in her bright purple and pink SUV and speaking to regional reporters. She has traveled to 48 states so far, all but Alaska and Hawaii, and admits that, while the Caravan is a daunting project, it's a necessary one for her. Maggie struggles to balance her own life with this unending passion project, as she continues to work as a psychologist with an emphasis on trauma and grief therapy, fields she has, tragically, become all too familiar with over her life. She has dedicated her life to helping others move past their own issues, including combat veterans, and while speaking to a Tulsa area class earlier this year, she told them her trick for dealing with her daughter's loss. Quote, "Walking through it instead of away from it is how you heal. Trying not to feel is what can kill you." Brittany's older brother, Josh, struggled heavily for the first few years after Brittany's death. His sister and he had grown close during her final months in Tulsa, and he was the first person notified by police that fateful evening. Thankfully, according to Maggie, he is now doing well and has a family of his own. Maggie, meanwhile, continues to speak out about Brittany every chance she gets. In fact, when I spoke to her earlier this week, she told me that she was preparing another round of press conferences and public events as we spoke. She has become a bit of a hero of mine for her perseverance in the face of such adversity, but she refuses to accept any of these labels, saying that she is simply a mother doing what any parent would.
Well, I don't mind, any amount of time spending on this, but, I feel like I've talked about everything. I mean, I am a psychologist. I've been a trauma therapist for 30 plus years. And, that's the other frustrating part is that, being a rape survivor, having had PTSD, having had gotten better and stuff before I started working in this field, I taught Brittany about safety. I taught Brittany about, how to, walk safe, go into your home safe, all those things. And the unfortunate thing is he probably woke her up in the middle of the night and she didn't have any ability to defend herself. So, that's one frustrating part. And two, it really didn't help me in those early years. You can help other people, but when it happens to you, it was like I almost got angry and said, okay, I had more than enough personal experiences that I went through that have made me a good trauma therapist. I didn't need anything else to add to the mix to make me understand things better. So, it's one of those double-edged swords. So, but it's given me the ability, probably in some ways, even to connect to a lot of the combat vets that I work with. Not that they know my story, but I'm able to express an understanding about the losses that they've had, at a level that they feel like I understand. So.
Brittany Phillips is remembered by those that knew and loved her. This includes her mother, brother, father, friends, and other surviving loved ones. According to them, she was an incredibly beautiful, kind, compassionate, intelligent, and wise 18-year-old at the time of her death. And that is how they remember her today. Nowadays, she is featured in the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation Unsolved Murder playing cards, which are distributed to inmates all over the state. The DNA sample retrieved at the crime scene may hold the key to finding her killer, and Brittany's family believes that time is drawing close. But police want to keep public attention on the case. They believe that it only takes one person to see her photo, or the snapshot image of her supposed killer, to start talking. If you know anything, you are encouraged to make contact with the Tulsa Police Department, who continue to oversee this case. They, like all of us, hope that Brittany's case will be solved in the near future. But until then, her story, as well as the stories of her loved ones, remain unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. Before I move on to some news about the show, I would like to thank Dr. Maggie Zingman for speaking to me about her daughter. And I would also like to thank Lindsay Schrod, the person behind the website The Chrysalis Chapters, for getting us in touch. Please check out Lindsay's website, which I will link in the show notes, and be on the lookout for Dr. Zingman's Caravan to Catch a Killer, which is undoubtedly heading your way sometime soon. Now, on to the news. Unfortunately, I have some bad news for listeners of the show. This will be the last full-length episode of the season, as I'm going to be taking a few weeks off from Unresolved. As I've spoken briefly about in some prior episodes, my wife and I are going to be moving from Georgia to the DC region. And with it being a military move that has happened really suddenly, we're kind of trying to figure out everything on the fly. So I do apologize, as this has kind of happened without warning. However, since I don't really adhere to the season format, quote-unquote, this just means that there will be no new Unresolved for a few weeks. I hope to be back in either the end of June or the beginning of July with a new batch of episodes. And I'm very excited to announce that I'm going to be going back to more multi-parters in the next season. If you haven't noticed, I've been doing a lot of standalone episodes this season, but I'm excited to be getting back into the nitty-gritty process of some more in-depth research. Now, with that being said, I will still be doing the Patreon stuff during this short break, and I'm also hoping to release a series of small updates for stories I've previously covered, many of which aren't necessarily resolved, quote-unquote, but are in a much different state than when I originally covered them. If you would like to stay up to date with the podcast on social media, just look for Unresolved or Unresolved Pod on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Emails can be sent in to michael@unresolved.me. That's micheal@unresolved.me. And text messages or voicemails can be sent in to 831-200-3550. If you would like to learn more about the show, view episode transcripts, look over my sources, buy an item from the podcast store, click on the Patreon page, or anything else really, just head to unresolved.me. Once again, that's unresolved.me. Before I go, I would like to thank the following producers who help support the show each month on Patreon. These producers are Maggie James, Ben Crocum, Roberta Jansen, Quill Carter, Peggy Bellarda, Matthew Brock, Laura Hannon, Astrid Nair, Evan White, Catherine Vattalaro, Damian Moore, Amy Hampton Miller, Timothy Stratton, Scott Meesey, Stephen Wilson, Sarah Williamson, Scott Patzold, Kathy Marie, and Marie Vangland. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for listening. This has been the longest and most successful season of Unresolved to date, and I honestly could not do it without you. I hope that you'll be hearing a new episode from me in just a few weeks, but until then, stay safe, and I will talk to you later.